What if I told you that I want to be judged? That I, as an Atlas student who does not get graded, want to be assessed. It's pretty weird, right? Well, what if it weren't? What if it actually makes perfect sense that I want to be graded, assessed, or judged? Today I'm going to explore that idea. I'm going to talk you through my findings of my research, and I'm going to explain how we can make more use of assessments so that it becomes a powerful tool instead of a painstaking chore. But before we dive into that concept concretely, I'm going to first provide you with some background. I'm going to tell you that we should focus on learning. But why is that? In modern day society, we are overloaded with information. Actually, already back in 2003, Vermunt put it as follows. I'm going to read it out loud. What we know and can do today is going to be outdated in a couple of years. The consequence, we need people that are going to learn throughout their life. Lifelong learners. This is not new. Vermunt said it in 2003, Einstein said similar things back in his day, and yet, in a recent article by TU Delft Vice President and Professor Robert Mudde, he came to the conclusion that currently, and I'm going to read it out loud again, currently lifelong learning is not seen as an obligation, but as an extra responsibility, and sometimes a burden. Wow. Okay, so this readily accepted notion for more than 20 years still fails to be adequately implemented in our education. I see a certain tension developing there. Worse yet, we have an entire sustainable development goal related to promoting lifelong learning experiences. And yet, still, no concrete results are happening. If anyone can explain to me why that is, you'd make me very happy. Thanks, PowerPoint. So, to focus on the process. It means that we need to define what it means to be a lifelong learner. Because if we want to focus on creating that lifelong learning opportunities, we of course need to actually try and achieve that. So what makes a lifelong learner? Very good question, audience. Well, if that is the tool we set out to achieve, we can take many different approaches. I chose the approach of process-oriented education because it aligns well with the Atlas philosophy, and recent work by Professor Dr. Mieke Boon has also explored this idea, and the conversation with my peers as well during the philosophy class. So if we take process-oriented education and we look into the literature, we actually find that process-oriented educational approaches positively influences lifelong learning. Through process-oriented education, we learn how to learn. And it's sad that Percival is not here, because he would have told us that learning how to learn is actually a higher order thinking skill. A higher order thinking skill that we can use to foster process-oriented education. And likewise, process-oriented education helps us to create higher order thinking skills. But there's more. Marijn today talked about scaffolding. Scaffolding is a great tool to actually exceed people's potentials, to help people progress in their learning processes. There's more. Renzo talked about self-directed learning, and I would like to introduce self-regulated learning as well as a closely related concept. And if we look further into the literature about this, there is something that is very concretely going to help us to achieve self-regulated learning in particular, to lesser extent self-directed learning, but it's going to help process-oriented education. It's called formative assessment. Very nice. So now we have a rich toolbox that we can draw ideas from to achieve process-oriented education and in the end lifelong learning. Remember, that's the goal. But why is there actually a need to change the status quo? What's wrong with the current conventions? I think it has to do with preconceptions from two sides. Preconceptions from students who believe that after they are assessed, they've reached the end. Hooray! We've managed our assignment, we got a grade, maybe even a 10, and students think they're done learning. Well, actually, I have sad news for them. You're never done learning. But if we implant the seed that you can actually be done with learning, then we kill the need to continue learning. And we let them deceive themselves that there is actually an endpoint to learning. But that's such a shame, because we aren't. Like Einstein said, it is the life process worth of learning that is going to actually help you, and that's actually going to provide some great things. On the other hand, we have assessors that are bombarded with these assessment rubrics that they need to use to grade students objectively. Actually, work by Tam, and I'm going to read it out loud again, says that many lecturers use the rubric in a very mechanical and unconscious manner and view it mostly as a grading tool with limited instructional value. Well, if these are the preconceptions, then I am not too surprised that many teachers don't like assessment rubrics. This sounds like a chore. This does not sound like a way in which we can actually help students grow in their learning. Okay, but if this is the status quo, then there is tension, and we need to improve. We need to start seeing the rubrics as a guide. We now have it as a tool, as stated before, but we want to work towards something more meaningful. A guide, a roadmap, a compass. And in order to do so, we go back to the formative assessments. Because the formative assessments are actually ways to monitor learning processes. In my definition, or actually Rabbi University's definition, a formative assessment gives the student feedback on his or her progress and indicates what the student still needs to do to reach the end goal. The end goal can be the end goal that you set out in your PDP. It can be the intended learning outcome of a project. And through formative assessments, we help ourselves to check in, and we help ourselves to identify our learning needs. This actually happens already. We have a semester 2 project currently in Atlas, where students are presented with the assessment rubrics at the beginning so they know what to work towards. We see it in the biomedical engineering department, where also rubrics are used so that students learn about their own learning processes. And my favorite example, in the educational sciences and technology department, Professor Dr. Susan McKenney says, here's a rubric, go use it, it's going to help you. And actually, she makes that more concrete. She shows us what we need to do to assess ourselves so that we create better end projects. And from personal experience, I can tell this really works. This creates the impact that we need in order to progress in our educational system. It's the guide. Let that sink in. The rubric is actually the guide. It is not the chore. It is a powerful tool that it can be. For students, my peers, and also for assessors and teachers. It's been researched, and it shows that it helps everyone to stick towards the goal. It helps provide vocabulary, it helps provide a framework, and it helps provide a benchmark within which we can discuss things like group projects, things like individual projects. And if we view assessments as such, it's easier to appreciate them. It can be a conversation starter, and it can be a conversation partner. Instead of a check the box, oh, this is what we need to do. Because that's not nice. But a conversation partner sounds much more mellow and much more useful. So instead of focusing on either a process or a product, why not focus on process and product by using formative assessment? And this is going to help us to elevate our learning processes from where we start initially to where we want to go. So then, to formative assessments themselves. This is what it can look like in my personal view. You start off with a project, you work on it for a little, you have the assessment rubrics presented to you, and throughout your process you develop your ideas, you develop your deliverables, and throughout that a assessor, which can be a tutor, it can be the course coordinator, or it even can be a TA, helps you with the formative assessments. You sit down together, you have a discussion about your work, you grade yourself first, and you discuss that with the teacher or the TA or the tutor. At the end, you use a sort of reflection report on the combined formative assessments to create a summative assessment. That means that we need to begin with student-led formative assessments, using those rubrics. And this is going to be very interesting, because if students fill out the rubrics themselves first, then actually it has been shown that this fosters self-regulated learning. Not only that, teachers and assessors can scaffold students by feedback, which we all have come to love in Atlas. And even if teachers struggle with giving feedback, we have some great principles. For example, the seven principles by Nicole McFarlane-Dick to help teachers in this assessment process. And lastly, very valuable, this provides a third conversation partner to the assessment, an objective thing to fall back on, which can look something like this. Now, I don't know about you, but I would be very upset if someone walks in with an assessment rubric in front of his face, but you get the idea. It's something reliable to fall back on that doesn't make the conversation too personal. It makes sure that you stick to the core. That means that we need to create very good rubrics. It means that teachers bear great responsibility. If the rubric isn't right, then the formative assessments are difficult, and in the end, the learning processes are impeded. And admittedly, there is a huge gap here. Teachers are not adequately trained to create, to use, and to talk about these rubrics together with students. More research is thus needed, and better frameworks should be created. But luckily for us, some great efforts are already made, for example, by Burkhardt. How will assessment then help? A little bit more concretely. Look at it as your compass, like we said earlier. From the get-go, you see what the end goal is, what you need to work towards. It's in the rubric. And if you do that from point one, you know what you're going to work towards. And if you use those formative assessments to help you throughout the process, in the end you end with a summative assessment in which you consider all of that. And you have a great end result. Little practical example to send you off with. This is me assessing myself on this presentation. When I first practiced, and it might be very difficult for you to understand what's going on here, but when I first practiced, this is what I thought of myself. I definitely know the answer to all the questions in life. I am not so good at coordination. And I actually wrote down, there goes my coordination. And I actually wrote down what I should improve for when I actually present right here, right now. 5 minutes before I started, I filled in the rubric again. And this is what you see. Things start to move in the right direction. Wonderful. And this is super satisfying. I practiced a lot, I tried a lot, I identified my learning needs, and by these formative assessments, and I didn't even need anyone else for this, I managed to grow myself and exceed my initial potential. Now this is where I can send you off with. But, hang on a minute. Because I want to give you one final thing for thought. What if we do this? What if we actually start using these rubrics in the way we do, and in the way I propose? More profound learning experiences, and you don't have to believe me on this. This is what the literature tells you. Significant general knowledge and application learning effects, already back in 1995. From conversations with Mieke, I discovered that this can actually help to deepen scientific understanding by focusing on your learning processes. And as we saw earlier, it can help to acquire higher order thinking skills, which is also what Vermunt saw in his research. It helps us to become self-regulated and self-directed learners because we used those theories when we constructed this whole idea. It is in the end thus going to help us to become the lifelong learners that we initially set out to become. And lastly, Vermunt saw that by focusing on the process, we do not only have better processes, but also better results. This really works. So, my argument today is clear. Focus on the process so that we create lifelong learning, so that we achieve that goal. And if we do so, if we commit ourselves to it, I truly believe that one day, not too far away, lifelong learning can become the norm instead of the goal. Thank you.